The massive longhorn stood alone in the dusty corral, nostrils flaring, eyes wild with a fury born from years of mistreatment. Men gathered at a safe distance, their faces etched with fear and disgust. "That cow is pure beast," they whispered. "Can't be tamed." But Standing Cloud watched from the shadows, seeing what others missed: intelligence in those eyes, caution in her movements, and scars telling a story of survival. While the ranch hands argued about putting her down, the Apache man made his decision. Without fanfare, he approached the fence. What secret did Standing Cloud know that the others couldn't see? What wisdom would transform a feared beast into the most loyal protector the territory had ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whiskey Creek Ranch had a history as dark as the thunderclouds that gathered over the distant mountains. The previous owner, Old Man Harrison, had died 3 winters past, leaving the operation to his son Jeremiah, a man with none of his father's patience and twice his temper. Under Jeremiah's watch, the ranch developed a reputation for harsh treatment of both animals and men. The longhorn cow had come with a herd purchased from down Texas way. Even then, the drovers had warned Jeremiah about her. "That one's got the devil in her eyes," they'd said. But Jeremiah saw only her size and the potential for strong calves. He paid no mind to the warnings. From the beginning, she resisted. When ranch hands attempted to brand her, she broke through the holding pen, trampling a man named Tucker. He still walked with a limp and carried a torn, dusty hat as evidence of his encounter. "That beast nearly killed me," he'd tell anyone who'd listen at Hadley's saloon, pulling out the hat with the perfect crescent tear where her horn had caught it as he rolled away. After the branding incident, things only worsened. She refused to be herded, scattered other cattle when confined with them, and once gored clean through a pine fence post when a hand tried to rope her. 2 horses had been injured trying to control her, and Jeremiah's prized bull was found dead in a ravine after being placed in the same pasture with her. "That cow is pure beast," became the common refrain in Bitter Springs. Children were warned to stay clear of the Whiskey Creek North pasture where she was eventually isolated. Travelers passing through heard tales of the demon cow that grew more fantastic with each telling. "Saw her eyes glow red under the full moon," claimed Wilbur Jenkins after too many whiskeys. "She can predict when a man's gonna die," whispered Sarah Miller at the general store. That's why Harrison sold her to Jeremiah. He knew his time was coming. Even the local Paiute avoided that section of grazing land, though they never explained why. Their silence only fed the superstitions. What nobody discussed was how Jeremiah's men had tried to break her spirit. The cattle prod they used more often than necessary. The days without water as punishment for her defiance. The rocks thrown by bored hands trying to get a reaction. All this Standing Cloud had observed during his quiet watches from the ridgeline above the ranch over the past months. Standing Cloud had first noticed her 3 weeks earlier while tracking a wounded deer. He had watched from a distance as 3 ranch hands attempted to move her to a different pasture. Their cursing carried on the wind as they cracked whips and hollered. The cow stood her ground until one hand threw a burning stick that singed her flank. Then she charged, scattering the men like quail, one barely making it to his horse in time. Instead of continuing his hunt, Standing Cloud had stayed, observing how she paced the fence line after the men left, how she positioned herself with the sun at her back, how she tested each section of the fence methodically. There was nothing demonic in her behavior, only intelligence and the instinct to survive. In the days that followed, he returned often to watch her. He noticed how she drank only at dawn when no one was around, how she would stand guard while other isolated cattle grazed, how she positioned herself to watch the approach to the pasture from all directions. A beast, yes, but not in the way the town whispered about. This was a creature that had learned harsh lessons about humans and applied that knowledge to stay alive. When word came that Jeremiah had finally given up on her and was planning to shoot her after failing to sell her at auction, Standing Cloud knew it was time to act. He had watched long enough. Standing Cloud had not intended to stay in Bitter Springs. The small settlement had been merely a waypoint on his journey following the drought that had driven his people from their traditional lands farther south. 3 years of failed rains had forced difficult choices. While many from his band traveled north to join relatives near the Big River, Standing Cloud had chosen a different path. "The mountains speak to me," he had told the Elder Council when explaining his decision to head west alone. They understood. Each Apache found their own way to honor the spirits that guided them. Standing Cloud carried little with him. Just his horse, weapons, and the medicine pouch his grandmother had sewn for him before returning to the spirit world. The small buckskin bag contained herbs for healing, sacred stones from his homeland, and a single eagle feather. The pouch hung always at his hip, a constant connection to his ancestors and their wisdom. His arrival in Bitter Springs had caused the usual stir that a lone Apache brought to frontier towns. Women pulled children closer as he rode down the main street. Men watched with hands resting near gun belts. The livery stable owner grudgingly allowed him to water his horse but quoted a price for feed that was triple the going rate. Standing Cloud had said nothing, simply paid with 2 silver coins, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. He had lived among white settlements enough to recognize the pattern. First came fear, then curiosity, eventually a cautious acceptance if he proved useful. His skills with horses and livestock usually opened doors that would otherwise remain closed. The drought had created opportunity. Ranchers were desperate for hands who understood animals and could help preserve what remained of their herds through the dry season. Standing Cloud's reputation had preceded him in subtle ways. Whispers passed between settlements about the Indian who can calm any horse, and the Apache who found water where others saw only dust. Sheriff Mills had approached him on his second day in town, not with suspicion but with an offer. Mason out at Creeksides looking for someone to help him move his remaining cattle to the high meadow, the lawman had said, bigger than his common sense. Following him to Montana had seemed romantic at 20. 11 years, 3 children, and countless mining camps later, Michael died in a tunnel collapse, leaving them with nothing but debts. The mining company claimed no responsibility. The creditors took their home and belongings. When the foreman suggested Martha could earn their keep in ways no decent woman would consider, she gathered her children in the night and fled. They'd traveled for weeks, taking odd jobs where she could find them, sleeping in barns or under the stars until the winter drove them to this abandoned trapper's cabin. Martha had tried to find honest work in the nearby town of Pinewood, but a woman alone with children raised suspicions. The boarding house wouldn't take them. The general store had no positions. The restaurant owner had offered her work, but his wandering hands made clear what kind of work he had in mind. Sarah stirred on the pallet, her small face pinched with hunger even in sleep. Beside her, Emma clutched the rag doll Martha had made from scraps of Michael's old shirt, the only keepsake they had of him. The doll's button eyes had come from Martha's best dress, sold months ago for food. Martha knelt beside her children, touching Sarah's forehead. Still warm. The fever that had started 2 days ago worried her more than anything. Without proper food and medicine, "I had no choice," she whispered, as much to convince herself as anyone else. "God forgive me." Outside, she tied the cow to a stunted pine and milked it into their only pot. Her hands remembered the motions from childhood on her father's farm. The animal gave easily, clearly used to daily milking. Martha felt a twinge of guilt, knowing the farmer would suffer without his cow, but her children would die without food. She brought the milk inside and placed it near the fire to warm. Its rich smell filled the cabin, the first wholesome thing to grace their home in weeks. "Mama," Sarah's voice, weak with fever. "Is that milk?" "Yes, sweetheart." Martha smoothed her daughter's hair. "Real milk. You'll feel better soon." "Where'd it come from?" James asked, suddenly awake and suspicious beyond his years. He'd grown watchful since his father's death, assuming responsibilities no child should bear. "A blessing," Martha answered, not meeting his eyes. "Drink it while it's warm." Emma woke, rubbing her eyes with tiny fists. "I'm hungry, Mama." "I know, baby. We all are. But look." Martha poured milk into their 3 chipped cups. "Tonight we feast." The children drank eagerly. Martha added the last of their cornmeal to the remaining milk, making a thin gruel that bubbled over the fire. The simple meal would be the most substantial thing they'd eaten in weeks. "Tomorrow I'll look for work again," she promised, more to herself than the children. "Things will get better." A sound outside stopped her heart, the crunch of boots on snow. James heard it too, his head snapping up. Martha put a finger to her lips and reached for the kitchen knife, the only weapon they possessed. "Stay here," she whispered, moving toward the door. But before she reached it, a sharp knock echoed through the cabin. They'd been found. Sheriff Wilson polished his badge with the corner of his handkerchief, a morning ritual performed with the same precision as loading his revolver. 23 years wearing the star in Pinewood had earned him respect, if not affection. He wasn't paid to be liked. "Another vagrant family squatting up by Miller's Creek," Deputy Collins reported, stomping snow from his boots. "Woman with 3 young ones." Locals spotted smoke from the old Prescott cabin. Wilson sighed, pinning the badge to his chest. "That abandoned trapper's shack? It's hardly fit for animals, let alone children. Want me to run them off? County ordinance is clear about squatters." The sheriff considered this. Winter had come early and fierce this year. "No, let them be for now. Nature will move them along soon enough." He reached for his coat. "I'm heading to Peterson's. Keep an eye on things." Main Street was already bustling despite the early hour. Pinewood had grown from a struggling outpost to a respectable town in the 2 decades since silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. The mines had played out years ago, but the town remained, sustained by the cattle ranches that had spread across the valley. Wilson nodded to Mrs. Abernathy sweeping the boardwalk in front of her millinery shop, tipped his hat to Reverend Simmons hurrying toward the white steepled church at the end of the street. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. His job was keeping it that way. The bell above Peterson's general store jingled as Wilson entered. The warmth inside was welcome after the biting cold. "Morning, Sheriff." Elias Peterson looked up from the ledger spread before him. At 62, the storekeeper's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his mind remained sharp as a tack. Nothing happened in Pinewood without Peterson knowing about it. "Coffee's fresh." Wilson helped himself to a cup. "Heard we got new visitors up at the old Prescott place." Peterson nodded, making a note in his ledger. "Woman came in yesterday looking for work. Hayes, she called herself. Widow with 3 little ones. Wanted to know if I needed help with inventory or cleaning." "You turn her away?" "Had to. Business is slow this winter." Peterson lowered his voice. "Henry Crawford was in here when she came. Offered her a position at his ranch." Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Did she take it?" "No. Seemed frightened by the offer, if you ask me." Peterson shrugged. "Can't blame her. Crawford's reputation with unattached women is well known." The bell jingled again as Henry Crawford himself entered, bringing a blast of cold air and the scent of expensive cologne. At 45, Crawford owned the largest cattle ranch in the county and made sure everyone knew it. His tailored clothes and polished boots stood in stark contrast to the practical attire of most Pinewood residents. "Gentlemen," Crawford nodded, removing his leather gloves. "Discussing our new arrivals, I presume? Unfortunate situation." "Nothing that concerns you, Henry," Wilson said flatly. Crawford smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be natural. "On the contrary, all of Pinewood concerns me. I've invested heavily in this town's future." He turned to Peterson. "I need 2 crates of supplies delivered to the ranch by noon. My housekeeper will provide the list." "Of course, Mr. Crawford." Peterson's tone was deferential. After Crawford departed, Wilson spat into the brass spittoon by the stove. "Man acts like he owns the whole county. Getting closer to it every day," Peterson murmured. "Bought the old Miller place last month. That's 4 farms this year alone." Wilson frowned. "Thomas Blackwood still holding out?" "Stubborn as ever. The word is he's struggling since Elizabeth passed. Crawford's made offers." The mention of Blackwood stirred something in Wilson's memory. "Thomas reported anything missing recently?" Peterson thought for a moment. "Can't say he has." "Why?" "Just curious." The sheriff drained his coffee. "Think I'll ride out to check on our new arrivals. Make sure those children are being cared for properly." Outside, Wilson mounted his horse and headed north. The woman had looked desperate when she'd come to his office seeking work last week. Desperation made people unpredictable. The Prescott cabin lay beyond Thomas Blackwood's farm. He'd check both properties while he was out. The town fell behind him as he rode, the well-kept buildings giving way to scattered homesteads. Pinewood was preparing for its annual winter festival, scheduled for the weekend before Christmas. Colorful banners already hung from the town hall, and Peterson's store window displayed pine garlands and red ribbons. For most, it would be a season of celebration. For others, like the widow Hayes and her children, or the reclusive Thomas Blackwood, winter brought only hardship and isolation. Wilson had seen it before. The divide between those who thrived and those who merely survived grew wider when snow blanketed the valley. As sheriff, he walked the line between them, enforcing the law while exercising what mercy he could. But his mercy, like the winter itself, had limits. Martha stood frozen before the door, the knife clutched in white-knuckled fingers. Another knock, firmer this time. "I know you're in there," a man's voice called, deep, weathered, but not immediately threatening. "I've tracked my cow to your door." James appeared at her side, a rusted fireplace poker in his small hands. "I'll protect us, Ma," he whispered. Martha's heart broke at the sight. Her 8-year-old son shouldn't have to be the man of the house. She gently took the poker from him. "Stay with your sisters," she instructed, voice steadier than her nerves. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door just wide enough to see through. A tall man stood in the snow, rifle slung over his shoulder but not in his hands. His face was lined with age and hardship, black beard streaked with gray, eyes the color of the winter sky. Behind him, Martha could see the cow tethered to a tree. "That's my animal," he said simply, nodding toward the cow. Martha tightened her grip on the knife, keeping it partially hidden in the folds of her skirt. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's gaze shifted past her to the pot of thin gruel bubbling over the fire, then to the 3 children huddled together on the pallet. The smallest one, Emma, was drinking milk from a chipped cup. "I think you do," he replied, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. A fit of coughing from inside the cabin drew Martha's attention. Sarah's fever had worsened overnight. The man's eyes narrowed. "Your child is sick." It wasn't a question, and Martha saw no point in denying it. "Yes. May I come in?" he asked, surprising her. "I'll leave the rifle outside." Martha hesitated, then nodded once. The man carefully propped his rifle against the cabin wall, well away from the door, and waited. She stepped back, letting him enter while keeping herself between him and her children. The cabin's interior revealed their desperate circumstances more clearly than words could. The single room was nearly bare, no furniture save for a 3-legged stool and a crate serving as a table. The fire struggled with damp wood, more smoke than flame. The thin gruel in the pot would barely feed 1 person, let alone 4. "I'm Thomas Blackwood," the man said, removing his hat. "That's my cow you took." "Martha Hayes," she replied, still clutching the knife. "And yes, I took your cow. My children were starving." Thomas knelt beside Sarah, touching her forehead with a gentleness that surprised Martha. "How long has the fever been on her?" "3 days. It's getting worse." He nodded, his expression grave. "She needs medicine, and better food than that." He gestured to the watery gruel. "We make do with what we have," Martha said defensively. "Which is why you took my cow." Thomas stood, looking around the cabin again. His eyes landed on the rag doll clutched in Emma's hands, its button eyes and patchwork body speaking of love made from scraps. "Your husband, dead. Mining accident last spring." Thomas nodded as if this explained everything. "Perhaps it did." "Are you taking us to jail?" James asked suddenly, stepping forward with his chin raised defiantly. Thomas looked at the boy with something like respect. "No, son. I'm not the sheriff." "But you'll tell him," Martha said. It wasn't a question. "I should," Thomas replied. "Stealing's against the law." "Then do it," Martha challenged, desperation making her bold. "But the cow stays until he arrives. My children will have one decent meal before they're made orphans." The cabin fell silent except for Sarah's labored breathing and the crackling of the fire. Thomas studied Martha for a long moment, seeing not just the threadbare dress and exhausted face, but the fierce determination in her eyes. Here was a woman who would do anything to protect her children, even steal from a man as desperate as herself. "I have a proposition," he said finally. Martha tensed. She'd heard propositions before from men who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. "I'm not that kind of woman." Thomas's face flushed. "Neither am I that kind of man, I mean." He cleared his throat. "I meant an arrangement. A business arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "Return the cow to my farm. Work for me until spring, helping with chores, cooking, whatever needs doing. In exchange, I'll provide shelter for you and your children. Proper food. Medicine for your girl." He gestured to the cabin. "Better than this, anyway." Martha stared at him suspiciously. "Why would you help us?" "I stole from you." "I need the help," Thomas said simply. "Farm's too much for one person. Been letting things go since my wife passed. And we'd stay... where? Got plenty of room in the house. Separate bedrooms." He added hastily, "Proper arrangements. Nothing unseemly." Martha weighed her options, which were few. Stay here and watch her children starve or freeze. Move on in winter with a sick child. Accept charity from a stranger whose property she'd stolen. Sarah coughed again, the sound rattling deep in her chest. "I'll need to see this farm of yours first," Martha said finally, "before I decide." Thomas nodded. "Fair enough. But the cow comes with me now." "After my children eat," Martha countered. A hint of a smile crossed Thomas's weathered face. "You're in no position to bargain, Mrs. Hayes. And yet here I am, bargaining." Dawn broke cold and clear as Thomas's wagon approached his farm. Martha sat beside him on the bench, Sarah wrapped in blankets on her lap. James and Emma huddled in. The wagon bed with their few possessions. A change of clothes for each, Martha's sewing kit, the rag doll, and a Bible with faded family names inscribed on yellowed pages. Martha had spent a restless night considering Thomas's offer. In the light of morning, the farmhouse coming into view confirmed her decision. Though showing signs of neglect, peeling paint, missing shingles, and overgrown garden, it was solid. Shelter, safety, for now. "It's not much," Thomas said, misinterpreting her scrutiny. "But it's warm." "It's more than we had," Martha replied simply. The cow, tethered to the back of the wagon, lowed as if recognizing home. Thomas helped Martha down from the bench, then carefully lifted Sarah, whose fever had finally broken in the night. The girl stirred but didn't wake. "Children's rooms are upstairs," Thomas said as he carried Sarah toward the house. "Not used in some time, but clean enough." James jumped down and helped Emma from the wagon, his eyes wary as he surveyed their new surroundings. "Is this our home now, Ma?" For the winter, Martha answered, not wanting to make promises she couldn't keep. Thomas stopped at the front door, shifting Sarah's weight to free his hand. He reached into his pocket and withdrew an iron key, offering it to Martha. You'll need this. Martha stared at the key. I don't understand. Door key, Thomas said gruffly. Can't have you locked out if I'm in the fields. The simple practicality of it struck Martha deeply. This stranger was giving her access to his home after she'd stolen from him. She took the key, its weight substantial, in her palm. Inside, the house was tidy but sparse, as if half the furniture had been removed. A kitchen with a cast-iron stove. A sitting room with a stone fireplace. A dining table with 4 chairs. All clean, all functional, all bearing the unmistakable emptiness of a home that had lost its heart. Thomas led them upstairs to a hallway with 4 doors. Master bedroom's mine, he said, nodding to the end of the hall. These 3 are yours. He carried Sarah into the nearest room and gently placed her on a bed with a patchwork quilt. I'll fetch my wife's medicine chest, he said. Might have something for the fever. Left alone with her children, Martha inspected their new quarters. 3 bedrooms, simply furnished but comfortable. The windows looked out over fields now dormant under snow, a barn, and distant hills. After weeks in the one-room cabin, it seemed impossibly spacious. Ma, look, Emma called from another bedroom. A real bed. Thomas returned with a wooden chest inlaid with mother-of-pearl. He opened it on the bedside table, revealing neatly organized bottles and packets. Elizabeth was often ill, he explained, selecting a small brown bottle. Learned to keep remedies on hand. Your wife? Martha asked. Thomas nodded, measuring drops from the bottle into a spoon. 3 years gone now. Pneumonia. I'm sorry for your loss, Martha said quietly, as I am for yours. He administered the medicine to Sarah, who swallowed reflexively. This will help the fever. Rest will do the rest. Downstairs, Thomas showed Martha the kitchen. The pantry, when opened, revealed shelves nearly as bare as their own had been. Not much, he admitted. Was heading to town when I discovered the cow missing. Martha surveyed the meager supplies. Half a sack of flour, some dried beans, salt pork hanging from a hook, a few withered apples. I can make do, she said. I'm good at stretching what's available. We'll go to town tomorrow, Thomas replied. Stock up proper. The word "we" hung between them, foreign and uncertain. I should milk Bella, Thomas said after an awkward silence. Bella? The cow. A faint flush colored his cheeks. My wife named all the animals. Martha nodded, understanding more about this man with each passing minute. I can do it. I grew up on a dairy farm in Ohio. Thomas raised an eyebrow. That explains how you managed to lead her off without getting kicked. I'll need to see the rest of the farm, Martha said, if I'm to help properly. After breakfast, Thomas agreed. I've neglected the place. More than I should admit. We all neglect things when grief takes hold, Martha said softly. Thomas looked at her sharply, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Not just a thief, not just a desperate mother, but someone who understood loss as intimately as he did. I'll show you where the flour's kept, he said, his voice gruff again. Make biscuits if you've a mind to. Haven't had a proper breakfast in some time. As Thomas left for the barn, Martha stood in the unfamiliar kitchen, the iron key still clutched in her hand. This arrangement was born of necessity, not choice. A business transaction, her labor for their survival. Yet something in the way Thomas had looked at her children, in the gentleness with which he'd treated Sarah, suggested it might become something more. Not romance. Martha had no illusions about that. But perhaps, in time, a kind of friendship. For now, it was enough that her children would sleep in beds tonight, with full stomachs and a warm roof over their heads. Tomorrow could take care of itself. A week passed, each day establishing new rhythms in the farmhouse. Martha rose before dawn to kindle the kitchen fire and prepare breakfast. Thomas tended the animals, returning to find hot coffee and biscuits waiting. They ate mostly in silence, the children gradually filling the void with their chatter as they grew more comfortable. On the 8th morning, Martha found Thomas struggling with a broken fence post near the barn. Without a word, she set down the basket of eggs she'd collected and held the post steady while he hammered. "Need to replace most of these come spring," Thomas grunted. "Been patching them too long. My father used to say a farm is held together by good fences and better planning," Martha replied, bracing her shoulder against the weathered wood. Thomas paused mid-swing. "Smart man, your father." "He was." Martha adjusted her grip as the post wobbled. "Had one of the finest dairy farms in Greene County until the bank took it after the war." Thomas drove the last nail home and stepped back to assess their work. "You know cows, then? And crops? And finances?" Martha brushed splinters from her skirt. "I kept our ledgers until Michael took to gambling." Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't pry. Instead, he gestured toward the north field. "Been thinking of planting wheat there next season. Soil's good, but drainage is poor when the snow melts." Martha surveyed the land with a practiced eye. "You'd be better with barley. Less susceptible to root rot in wet conditions." Thomas considered this, then nodded. "Barley it is, then." That evening, Thomas returned from the barn to find Martha studying his farm ledger at the kitchen table, a deep furrow between her brows. "Found something interesting?" he asked, hanging his coat by the door. "You're losing money on milk," she said bluntly. "Selling too cheap to Peterson." Thomas bristled. "Been dealing with Elias for years. And he's been underpaying you for years." Martha tapped the column of figures. "Cream brings double if you separate it first. More work. More profit." Martha closed the ledger. "And the children could help with churning." As if summoned by mention, James appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Blackwood, the hayloft ladder is broken." "I almost fell." Thomas frowned. "You shouldn't be in the hayloft." "I was looking for kittens," the boy explained. "Emma wanted one." "There's no—" Thomas began, then stopped. "Actually, Bella's old Mauser might have had a litter. Haven't checked." "Could I help you fix the ladder?" James asked, his voice carefully casual. Thomas glanced at Martha, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Reckon I could use a hand," he said. "Know anything about carpentry?" "No, sir," James admitted. "But I can learn." Later, Martha watched from the kitchen window as Thomas patiently showed James how to measure and cut a wooden rung. The boy's face was serious with concentration, shoulders straight with pride at being treated as useful rather than a burden. That night, when the children were asleep, Martha joined Thomas by the fire. She'd taken to mending his shirts in the evenings, a task not explicitly part of their arrangement, but one that needed doing. "James never knew his grandfather," she said, threading her needle. "Michael's father died before we married, and mine passed when James was just a baby." Thomas poked at the embers. "Boy needs a man to show him things." "Yes." Martha's needle flashed in the firelight. "Thank you for being kind to him. He's a good lad. Wants to be useful." "Like his mother," Martha said with a small smile. Thomas almost smiled back, almost. "Farm's looking better with extra hands," he admitted. "Even small ones." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft sound of Martha's needle through fabric. Thomas pulled out his pocket knife and a piece of wood, whittling absently. "What are you making?" Martha asked after a while. Thomas seemed surprised by his own creation, a small figure taking shape beneath his blade. "Nothing in particular," but Martha could see it was a horse, carefully detailed despite his claim. Another piece of himself revealed, like the poetry she'd glimpsed in his journal while dusting his bedroom. 2 days later, Bella fell ill. Martha found Thomas in the barn well past midnight, The cow's breathing labored as she lay on her side in the straw. "Bloat," Thomas said grimly. "Could lose her by morning." Martha rolled up her sleeves. "Not if we can help it. My father's herd had this every spring. We need oil and a length of rubber hose." Thomas stared at her. "You know how to treat bloat? I told you, I grew up on a dairy farm." Martha was already moving toward the tool shelf. "Emma, fetch that tin of cooking oil from the pantry," she called to her daughter, who'd followed her to the barn despite the late hour. Through the night, they worked together, Martha directing while Thomas followed her instructions without question. By dawn, Bella was on her feet again, weakened but alive. Thomas leaned against the stall door, exhaustion and relief evident in his face. "You saved her." "We saved her," Martha corrected, just as tired but satisfied. Their eyes met over the cow's broad back, a moment of connection forged through shared purpose. For the first time since arriving at the farm, Martha felt something shift between them, a fragile bridge forming across the chasm of their separate griefs. "Coffee might be in order," Thomas suggested, his voice softer than usual. "After a night like this." Martha nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Coffee would be perfect. The winter deepened, days shortening as December progressed. Martha established a routine of cleaning one room thoroughly each day. Today was Thomas's bedroom, a space she entered with professional detachment despite its intimacy. She changed the bedding, swept the floor, and dusted the dresser where a single photograph stood in a silver frame. A younger Thomas beside a slender woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Elizabeth, Martha presumed, noticing how Thomas's face in the photograph held none of the sorrow that now seemed permanently etched into his features. As she moved the frame to dust beneath it, Martha noticed a thin chain. Picking it up, she found a gold wedding band suspended from it. Too small for Thomas's fingers, certainly Elizabeth's. He'd been carrying his wife's ring close to his heart. Martha quickly replaced it, feeling like an intruder. As she turned to leave, she noticed Thomas's leather journal on the nightstand. She'd seen him writing in it each evening but had respected his privacy. Now the open page caught her eye, not farm accounts but a poem. Her gaze fell upon a few lines before she could stop herself. "The house remembers your laughter, though I've forgotten the sound. These walls hold echoes I cannot hear, and I am lost and found." Martha stepped back, stricken by the raw grief in those words. She'd intruded on something deeply personal. Find something interesting? She whirled to find Thomas in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was cleaning and I read my private thoughts?" His voice was tight with anger. "It was an accident." Martha twisted her apron between her fingers. "I shouldn't have looked." Thomas crossed the room and closed the journal with a snap. "No, you shouldn't have. Your words are beautiful," Martha said softly. "Sad, but beautiful." Thomas's shoulders stiffened. "They're nothing, just a way to pass the time." "They're not nothing. They're how you keep her alive." His eyes met hers, surprise replacing anger. "Yes," he admitted after a moment, "though it doesn't work very well. I talk to Michael sometimes," Martha confessed. "When the children are asleep. Tell him about their day, ask his advice. It helps even knowing he can't answer." Thomas sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "Does it get easier?" "Different, not easier. The shape of the absence changes." Martha hesitated, then added, "I keep Michael's wedding ring on a string around my neck. I saw that you do the same with Elizabeth's." Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to his chest. "Seems we have more in common than farming." That evening, dinner was a tense affair. The children sensed the awkwardness between the adults, speaking only when spoken to. After they went upstairs, Martha approached Thomas by the fire. "I've overstepped," she said. "If you'd prefer, I can leave the cleaning of your room to you." Thomas stared into the flames. Elizabeth used to write poetry. Not just the sentimental verses most ladies compose, but real poetry about the land, the seasons. Published some in the county newspaper. He glanced up at Martha. Started writing myself after she died. Poor imitation, but it helps sometimes. It's not poor at all, Martha said gently. You don't need to flatter me, Mrs. Hayes. I've never been one for unnecessary flattery, Mr. Blackwood. She sat in the chair opposite him. And after weeks under your roof, perhaps you might call me Martha. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Thomas, then. Thomas, she repeated, testing the familiarity of it. A comfortable silence fell between them, the fire crackling and settling in the grate. Outside, snow began to fall, tiny crystals catching the lamplight as they drifted past the window. Will you tell me about her? Martha asked finally. Elizabeth. Thomas's hands stilled on the piece of wood he'd been whittling. For a moment, Martha thought he would refuse, retreat back behind his walls of grief. She loved spring best, he began slowly. Used to walk the fields as soon as the snow melted, looking for the first wildflowers. As the evening deepened, Thomas spoke more than Martha had heard in all their weeks together. He told her how he'd met Elizabeth at a harvest dance, how she'd insisted on painting the farmhouse white instead of the traditional red, how she'd kept bees and made the sweetest honey in the county. She sounds remarkable, Martha said when he finally fell silent. She was. Thomas set aside his whittling. Another horse, Martha noticed, nearly complete now. And you're Michael? Martha smiled sadly. Charming, restless, full of dreams but short on sense. She twisted the invisible ring beneath her dress. He loved the children fiercely, though he wasn't always there for them, always chasing the next opportunity, the next big strike. You loved him despite his faults, as he loved me despite mine. Martha looked up. We make allowances for those we care about. Their eyes met across the hearth, an understanding passing between them. They were two people shaped by loss, familiar with the geography of grief. The next morning, Martha found a small wooden horse outside her bedroom door, delicately carved, sanded smooth, and finished with beeswax. No note accompanied it, none was needed. She placed it on the windowsill where Emma found it later, exclaiming over the tiny details, the flowing mane, the graceful legs, the alert ears. Did you make this, Mama? Emma asked, eyes wide with wonder. No, sweetheart. Martha smiled. It was a gift from Mr. Blackwood. Thomas, Emma corrected with a child's directness. He said we should call him Thomas now. Thomas hitched the wagon early, frost crunching beneath his boots as he loaded empty crates for supplies. I should be back by midday, he told Martha, who stood in the doorway with a shawl pulled tight against the cold. Need anything particular from town? Thread if they have it. Blue or brown. She handed him a folded paper. And these items, if you can manage. Thomas pocketed the list without looking at it. Children need anything? The question surprised Martha. In the 3 weeks they'd been at the farm, Thomas had shown kindness to her children. But this was the first time he'd explicitly considered their wants. Emma's birthday is next week, she said hesitantly. She'll be 6. A peppermint stick would make her feel special. Thomas nodded, making a mental note. James doing all right with those boots? Noticed they're worn thin. They'll last the winter, Martha said, though they both knew it was unlikely. Thomas climbed onto the wagon seat. Weather's holding. Road should be clear. Martha watched him drive away, the wagon growing smaller until it disappeared around the bend. Alone for the first time since arriving, she felt a strange mixture of freedom and uncertainty. The children were still asleep upstairs, the morning chores complete. She had time, rare, precious time, to herself. She began in the kitchen, opening cupboards she hadn't fully explored. Behind a stack of plates, she found a ceramic music box painted with forget-me-nots. When she wound the key, it played a halting melody, clearly broken. Martha set it aside, thinking she might ask Thomas if he wanted it repaired. In the parlor, a large oak cabinet stood against the wall. Inside were books, dozens of them, arranged by some system Martha couldn't immediately discern. She ran her finger along the spines. Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, alongside practical volumes on agriculture and animal husbandry. On a lower shelf, bound in faded leather, was a collection of Elizabeth Browning's sonnets, the pages marked with pressed wildflowers. Martha continued her exploration, discovering a house that had once been a home. In the spare bedroom, a trunk yielded neatly folded baby clothes, tiny gowns and caps never worn, dreams never realized. Martha closed it gently, understanding another dimension of Thomas's grief. In town, Thomas tied his wagon outside Peterson's general store. The bell jingled as he entered, and conversations paused as heads turned to observe the reclusive farmer. "Thomas Blackwood," Elias Peterson said with genuine surprise. "Twice in 1 month. To what do we owe the pleasure?" "Supplies," Thomas answered simply, handing over Martha's list. Peterson adjusted his spectacles to read it. "Flour, sugar, coffee, thread? This is more than your usual order." Thomas met the storekeeper's curious gaze steadily. "Winter's long. Need to stock up." Peterson began gathering the items, his movements deliberate. "Heard you've got company out at your place. Widow Hayes and her brood." "News travels fast," Thomas remarked dryly. "Small town," Peterson shrugged, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Sheriff Wilson mentioned it. Said he was concerned about their welfare." "No need for concern," Thomas said. "They're well provided for." "Never took you for the charitable type, Thomas." "It's not charity. Mrs. Hayes works for her keep." Thomas inspected a pair of child-sized boots on display. "How much for these?" Peterson named a price that seemed high, but Thomas nodded without haggling. "Add them to my order." As Peterson wrapped the boots in brown paper, the store door opened, admitting Henry Crawford and 2 of his ranch hands. "Blackwood," Crawford said, removing his expensive leather gloves. "Unusual to see you in civilization." Thomas acknowledged him with a curt nod, turning back to his business with Peterson. "I hear you've taken in that vagrant woman and her children," Crawford continued, his voice carrying to ensure others in the store heard. "Very generous of you." Thomas stiffened but didn't respond. "Of course, people are talking," Crawford pressed. "A single man housing a young widow? Raises questions about propriety." Thomas turned slowly to face the rancher. "What happens on my farm is my business, Crawford." "Perhaps," Crawford smiled, thinly. "But when it affects the moral standing of our community, it becomes everyone's concern." "Mrs. Hayes is my housekeeper," Thomas stated flatly. "Nothing more." Crawford raised an eyebrow. "If you say so, though a proper arrangement would have the woman in town, returning to her own lodgings at night, not sleeping under your roof. With 3 young children? In winter." Thomas's voice remained calm, but his eyes hardened. "You suggest she walk 5 miles through snow each way?" "I suggest you consider appearances, Blackwood, or the sheriff might feel obliged to investigate further." The threat hung in the air between them. Thomas was aware of other customers watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "Mrs. Hayes and her children are welcome guests in my home," he said finally, each word measured. "Anyone who suggests otherwise is mistaken." Crawford smiled, a predator's grin. "Just looking out for the reputation of a neighbor and the virtue of a vulnerable woman." Thomas's hand clenched at his side, but he kept his composure. "If you're so concerned about vulnerable women, Crawford, perhaps you should pay fair wages to the laundresses at your ranch. I hear they can barely feed their families on what you provide." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Crawford's face darkened. "Watch yourself, Blackwood," You're not the only one who can make accusations. Not accusations. Observations. Thomas turned back to Peterson. I'll add a peppermint stick to my order. And that bolt of blue calico. Crawford stalked to the counter, deliberately bumping Thomas's shoulder as he passed. My usual order, Peterson. Deliver it today. Yes, Mr. Crawford, Peterson said, his earlier friendliness replaced by deference. Thomas paid for his purchases and loaded them into his wagon, aware of eyes following him from the store windows. As he climbed onto the seat, Sheriff Wilson approached. Blackwood, the lawman greeted him. Got a minute? Thomas sighed inwardly. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Thomas hitched the wagon early, frost crunching beneath his boots as he loaded empty crates for supplies. I should be back by midday, he told Martha, who stood in the doorway with a shawl pulled tight against the cold. Need anything particular from town? Thread if they have it. Blue or brown. She handed him a folded paper. And these items, if you can manage. Thomas pocketed the list without looking at it. Children need anything? The question surprised Martha. In the 3 weeks they'd been at the farm, Thomas had shown kindness to her children. But this was the first time he'd explicitly considered their wants. Emma's birthday is next week, she said hesitantly. She'll be 6. A peppermint stick would make her feel special. Thomas nodded, making a mental note. James doing all right with those boots? Noticed they're worn thin. They'll last the winter, Martha said, though they both knew it was unlikely. Thomas climbed onto the wagon seat. Weather's holding. Road should be clear. Martha watched him drive away, the wagon growing smaller until it disappeared around the bend. Alone for the first time since arriving, she felt a strange mixture of freedom and uncertainty. The children were still asleep upstairs, the morning chores complete. She had time, rare, precious time, to herself. She began in the kitchen, opening cupboards she hadn't fully explored. Behind a stack of plates, she found a ceramic music box painted with forget-me-nots. When she wound the key, it played a halting melody, clearly broken. Martha set it aside, thinking she might ask Thomas if he wanted it repaired. In the parlor, a large oak cabinet stood against the wall. Inside were books, dozens of them, arranged by some system Martha couldn't immediately discern. She ran her finger along the spines. Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, alongside practical volumes on agriculture and animal husbandry. On a lower shelf, bound in faded leather, was a collection of Elizabeth Browning's sonnets, the pages marked with pressed wildflowers. Martha continued her exploration, discovering a house that had once been a home. In the spare bedroom, a trunk yielded neatly folded baby clothes, tiny gowns and caps never worn, dreams never realized. Martha closed it gently, understanding another dimension of Thomas's grief. In town, Thomas tied his wagon outside Peterson's general store. The bell jingled as he entered, and conversations paused as heads turned to observe the reclusive farmer. Thomas Blackwood, Elias Peterson said with genuine surprise. Twice in 1 month. To what do we owe the pleasure? Supplies, Thomas answered simply, handing over Martha's list. Peterson adjusted his spectacles to read it. Flour, sugar, coffee, thread? This is more than your usual order. Thomas met the storekeeper's curious gaze steadily. Winter's long. Need to stock up. Peterson began gathering the items, his movements deliberate. Heard you've got company out at your place. Widow Hayes and her brood. News travels fast, Thomas remarked dryly. Small town, Peterson shrugged, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. Sheriff Wilson mentioned it. Said he was concerned about their welfare. No need for concern, Thomas said. They're well provided for. Never took you for the charitable type, Thomas. It's not charity. Mrs. Hayes works for her keep. Thomas inspected a pair of child-sized boots on display. How much for these? Peterson named a price that seemed high, but Thomas nodded without haggling. Add them to my order. As Peterson wrapped the boots in brown paper, the store door opened, admitting Henry Crawford and two of his ranch hands. Blackwood, Crawford said, removing his expensive leather gloves. Unusual to see you in civilization. Thomas acknowledged him with a curt nod, turning back to his business with Peterson. I hear you've taken in that vagrant woman and her children, Crawford continued, his voice carrying to ensure others in the store heard. Very generous of you. Thomas stiffened but didn't respond. Of course, people are talking, Crawford pressed. A single man housing a young widow raises questions about propriety. Thomas turned slowly to face the rancher. What happens on my farm is my business, Crawford. Perhaps, Crawford smiled thinly, but when it affects the moral standing of our community, it becomes everyone's concern. Mrs. Hayes is my housekeeper, Thomas stated flatly. Nothing more. Crawford raised an eyebrow. If you say so, though a proper arrangement would have the woman in town, returning to her own lodgings at night, not sleeping under your roof. With 3 young children? In winter? Thomas's voice remained calm, but his eyes hardened. You suggest she walk 5 miles through snow each way? I suggest you consider appearances, Blackwood, or the sheriff might feel obliged to investigate further. The threat hung in the air. Between them, Thomas was aware of other customers watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Mrs. Hayes and her children are welcome guests in my home, he said finally, each word measured. Anyone who suggests otherwise is mistaken. Crawford smiled, a predator's grin. Just looking out for the reputation of a neighbor and the virtue of a vulnerable woman. Thomas's hand clenched at his side, but he kept his composure. If you're so concerned about vulnerable women, Crawford, perhaps you should pay fair wages to the laundresses at your ranch. I hear they can barely feed their families on what you provide. A murmur ran through the onlookers. Crawford's face darkened. Watch yourself, Blackwood. You're not the only one who can make accusations. Not accusations. Observations. Thomas turned back to Peterson. I'll add a peppermint stick to my order. And that bolt of blue calico. Crawford stalked to the counter, deliberately bumping Thomas's shoulder as he passed. My usual order, Peterson. Deliver it today. Yes, Mr. Crawford, Peterson said, his earlier friendliness replaced by deference. Thomas paid for his purchases and loaded them into his wagon, aware of eyes following him from the store windows. As he climbed onto the seat, Sheriff Wilson approached. Blackwood, the lawman greeted him. Got a minute? Thomas sighed inwardly. What can I do for you, Sheriff? Thomas returned from town later than expected, his expression troubled as he unloaded the supplies. Martha helped carry packages into the kitchen, noticing his unusual silence. Did something happen in town? She finally asked, placing a sack of flour on the table. Thomas hesitated, then said, Sheriff Wilson paid me a visit, asked about you and the children. Martha's hands stilled on the brown paper parcel she was unwrapping. What did he want? Claimed he was checking on your welfare, Thomas said, hanging his coat by the door. But there was more to it. Crawford, Martha guessed, her voice flat. Thomas looked at her sharply. You know him? He offered me work when we first arrived in Pinewood. Martha's mouth tightened. The kind no decent woman accepts. Thomas nodded grimly. He was in Peterson's store. Made comments about our arrangement here. I'm causing you trouble, Martha said quietly. Perhaps we should. You're not going anywhere, Thomas interrupted. Not in winter, not with 3 children. The firmness in his voice surprised them both. Martha opened another package, revealing a bolt of blue calico fabric. This is lovely, she said, running her fingers over the material, but too dear for everyday use. Thought you might make something for the children, or yourself. Thomas looked uncomfortable with the gesture now that it was revealed. For Christmas. Martha blinked rapidly, touched by his thoughtfulness. Thank you. Thomas cleared his throat and reached into his coat pocket. Got something else. He produced a small pair of boots. For James. His are nearly worn through. Martha stared at the boots, then at Thomas. These must have cost. Boy needs proper footwear, he said gruffly. Can't have him getting frostbite. Before Martha could respond, Emma came running into the kitchen. You're back, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Thomas's legs in an impulsive hug. Thomas froze, clearly startled by the child's affection. Then, slowly he patted her head. Brought supplies, he said awkwardly. Emma beamed up at him. Did you bring anything special? Emma, Martha scolded gently. That's not polite. Thomas reached into his pocket again and pulled out a striped peppermint stick. Might have picked up something. Emma's eyes widened with delight. For me. Early birthday present, Thomas said, handing it to her. Mrs. Peterson wrapped it special. The little girl clutched the candy reverently. Thank you, Thomas. She threw her arms around him again, then ran off to show her siblings her treasure. Martha watched her go, a lump in her throat. You didn't have to do that. Wanted to, Thomas said simply. That night, a blizzard swept down from the mountains, howling around the farmhouse with frightening intensity. Martha tucked the children into bed with extra blankets, but by midnight, the temperature inside had dropped dangerously despite the fires burning in the hearths. Thomas knocked on her bedroom door, his breath visible in the frigid air. Stoves out in the children's rooms. Need to move everyone downstairs by the main fireplace. Martha quickly gathered her children, all three shivering despite being bundled in quilts. In the parlor, Thomas had pushed furniture aside and laid pallets near the massive stone fireplace, which offered the only real warmth in the house. All of you sleep here, he said. I'll keep the fire going through the night. Where will you sleep? Martha asked, settling the children on the makeshift beds. Chair's fine for me, Thomas replied, stoking the flames higher. The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows in their frames. Emma whimpered, burrowing closer to Martha. Scary, the child whispered. It's just wind, Martha soothed, stroking her daughter's hair. We're safe inside. Could tell a story, Thomas suggested unexpectedly. Might help. James looked up hopefully. A real story? Not from a book. Thomas settled into the armchair, his face half in shadow. My grandfather homesteaded this land. Came west with nothing but a wagon and a dream. Built this house with his own hands. As the blizzard raged outside, Thomas's deep voice filled the parlor with tales of early settlers, of harsh winters survived and spring's eventual return. The children listened, wide-eyed, until one by one they drifted to sleep. Only Martha remained awake, watching Thomas across the firelit room. You have a gift for storytelling, she said softly. Elizabeth always said so, he admitted. Used to make up stories for our nieces and nephews when they visited. You would have been a wonderful father, Martha said, the intimacy of the moment making her bold. Thomas was silent for so long that Martha thought she'd overstepped again. Finally, he said, We tried. For years. 2 miscarriages nearly broke her. Then the doctor said no more. I'm sorry, Martha whispered. Found those baby things, did you? Thomas asked, not unkindly. When you were cleaning today? Martha nodded. I shouldn't have pried. It's all right. Been too long locked away. Thomas gazed at the sleeping children. Sarah with her mother's features, James so serious even in sleep, little Emma clutching her candy stick. House needs children in it. They adore you, Martha said. Especially James. He follows you like a shadow. Good boy. Reminds me of myself at that age. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, The wind began to ease, the worst of the storm passing. "Get some sleep," Thomas said. "Gently. I'll watch over things." Martha lay down beside her children, pulling a quilt over herself. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was Thomas silhouetted against the flames, keeping vigil through the night. 3 days passed before the snow stopped and the world emerged transformed. Drifts reached the windowsills, trees bent under white burdens, the barn nearly buried. They remained confined to the house, existing in a world suddenly intimate and separate from all outside concerns. On the 4th morning, Martha found Thomas attempting to repair the broken music box she discovered in the kitchen cupboard. "It was a wedding gift," he explained, manipulating tiny gears with surprising delicacy. Played Elizabeth's favorite melody. As she watched him work, Martha realized with startling clarity that something had changed during those snowbound days. This was no longer merely shelter, no longer just an arrangement of convenience. Somehow, without her noticing, it had become home. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Thomas surprised everyone at breakfast. "Town's winter festival is Saturday," he announced, buttering a biscuit. "Thought we might attend." For pairs of eyes stared at him in astonishment. "You want to go to the festival?" Martha finally asked. "You?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Been thinking about what you said, about the children needing normal experiences." "We're really going to town?" Sarah asked, excitement lighting her face for the first time since her illness. "If your mother agrees," Thomas hedged, glancing at Martha. Martha hesitated. Their last trip to Pinewood had ended with whispers and sidelong glances. "Are you certain it's wise? After what happened with Crawford?" "Can't hide away forever," Thomas said. "Besides, there'll be sleigh rides for the children. Hot cider. Music." "Please, Mama," Emma begged, practically bouncing in her seat. Martha couldn't deny the appeal of a day's festivities after their isolation. "Very well," she agreed. "But we must prepare properly." The decision set off a flurry of activity. Martha spent the next 3 days sewing, transforming the blue calico into new dresses for the girls and a shirt for James. For herself, she let out the seams of her best dress, faded but still presentable with fresh collar and cuffs fashioned from scraps. Thomas, meanwhile, taught James to carve a simple wooden flute, much like the ones that would be sold at the festival stalls. "My father taught me when I was about your age," Thomas explained, guiding the boys' hands as they hollowed the soft pine. "Said a man should be able to make his own music." "Did your pa teach you lots of things?" James asked, focused intently on his work. "Some," Thomas replied. "Died young, though. Learned most from my grandfather." "My pa died in a mining accident," James said matter-of-factly. "I don't remember much about him." Thomas's hands stilled momentarily. "Your mother keeps his memory alive for you." James nodded. "But she can't teach me man things. Like this." He held up the half-finished flute. "Or how to fix fences." "No reason you can't learn those things," Thomas said carefully. "Even without your father." "Could you teach me?" James asked, looking up with hope so naked on his face that Thomas felt something catch in his chest. "Reckon I could," he answered, his voice gruff with emotion. "If you're willing to learn." The day before the festival, Martha found Sarah sitting on the porch despite the cold, sketching on a scrap of paper. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" Martha asked, pulling her shawl tighter against the winter air. Sarah showed her the paper, a simple but recognizable portrait of all of them. Martha, Thomas, and the 3 children standing in front of the farmhouse. "It's our family," Sarah explained. Martha stared at the drawing, unsure how to respond. "It's very good, but Thomas isn't." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence under her daughter's earnest gaze. "He takes care of us," Sarah said simply. "Like a father." Martha touched the drawing gently. "Things aren't always that simple, Sarah." "Why not?" her daughter asked with a child's directness. "You smile when he's around," He fixes things for us. We all live together. It's an arrangement, Martha explained. For the winter. Sarah looked unconvinced. Are we leaving when spring comes? The question caught Martha off guard. She'd been so focused on surviving the winter that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond it. I don't know, she admitted. That evening, Thomas took the children sledding on the gentle slope behind the barn. Martha watched from the kitchen window as he positioned Emma in front of him on the wooden sled, her small face alight with joy as they glided down the hill. James and Sarah followed on a second sled, their shrieks of laughter carrying through the crisp air. Thomas was different with the children, less guarded, more animated. He showed James how to steer, applauded Sarah's perfect descent, and patiently pulled Emma back up the hill when she refused to make the journey without him. When they finally came inside, cheeks flushed with cold and exertion, Thomas's eyes met Martha's across the kitchen. Something passed between them, a shared moment of simple happiness, so unexpected after their respective losses. Hot chocolate, Martha announced, turning to the stove to hide her flustered reaction. Perfect after sledding. Later, after the children were asleep, Martha found Thomas in the sitting room, oiling the runners of the sleds. Thank you for today, she said, sitting across from him. I haven't heard them laugh like that in a long time. Thomas continued his methodical work. Children need play as much as food and shelter. You're good with them, Martha observed. Patient. Easy to be patient with good children. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic sound of Thomas's cloth on wood. Sarah drew a picture today, Martha said finally, of all of us together. She called it our family. Thomas's hands stilled. Children form attachments quickly. Yes, Martha agreed. It's natural for them to seek stability, especially after what they've been through. And you? Thomas asked, looking up at her. What do you seek, Martha? The directness of his question startled her. Safety for my children, a chance to rebuild our lives. And after winter, when our arrangement ends. Martha twisted her hands in her lap. I haven't thought that far ahead. Perhaps you should, Thomas said quietly. Spring will come sooner than we think. The unspoken question hung between them. What then? Would she take her children and leave? Or was there a possibility of something more permanent, something neither of them had dared to name? We should retire, Martha said, suddenly needing distance from his perceptive gaze. Tomorrow will be a long day. As she climbed the stairs, Martha's thoughts whirled. The festival would be their first public appearance together. A respectable widow, her children, and the reclusive farmer who had taken them in. What would the townspeople think? What did she herself think of this unconventional household they'd created? And most troubling of all, when had Thomas Blackwood's opinion begun to matter so much to her? Saturday dawned bright and clear, the temperature mild enough to melt icicles hanging from the eaves. Martha rose early to prepare, plaiting the girl's hair with ribbons salvaged from her sewing basket and helping James polish his new boots to a shine. Thomas waited by the wagon, dressed in his Sunday best. A dark coat brushed free of lint, a clean shirt with a string tie. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair with water, transforming himself from rugged farmer to respectable gentleman. You look very handsome, Martha said without thinking, then blushed at her own boldness. As do you, Thomas replied, his eyes taking in her freshened dress and carefully arranged hair. That is, handsome isn't the right word. Fine. You look fine. The awkward compliment warmed Martha more than a more practiced one might have. The drive to town was filled with the children's excited chatter. As they approached Pinewood, Martha's anxiety returned. The streets were already crowded with wagons and sleighs, colorful bunting decorating the storefronts. Remember, she instructed her children, best behavior today. Stay close to me or Mr. Blackwood. Thomas, Emma corrected automatically. He said to call him Thomas. Thomas helped them down from the wagon, offering Martha his arm with formal courtesy. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded, placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. Together, they walked into the festival, 3 children trailing behind like ducklings. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused, heads turned, and whispers followed in their wake. Martha held her chin high, though her grip on Thomas's arm tightened. "Mrs. Hayes," Sheriff Wilson approached, tipping his hat. "Good to see you and the children looking well." "Sheriff," Martha acknowledged. "The children have been eager for the festival." Wilson's eyes moved to Thomas. "Blackwood, twice in town in 1 month. Must be a record." Thomas nodded stiffly. "Special occasion." The sheriff studied them, noting Martha's hand on Thomas's arm. "Indeed. Enjoy yourselves." He moved on, but Martha could feel his speculative gaze following them. Despite the initial awkwardness, the day quickly improved. The children were welcomed by others their age, Emma and Sarah joining a group making paper snowflakes, James falling in with boys rolling hoops along the frozen street. Martha found herself drawn into conversation with Mrs. Peterson by the baking contest table. The storekeeper's wife was initially reserved but warmed when Martha complimented her apple preserves. "You must enter the pie contest," Mrs. Peterson insisted, noting the interest with which Martha examined the entries. "There's still time." "Oh, I couldn't possibly." "Nonsense. Thomas mentioned you're an excellent baker." Mrs. Peterson smiled at Martha's surprise. "He was quite specific about your apple dumplings when he bought cinnamon last week." The thought of Thomas praising her cooking to others left Martha momentarily speechless. "You have an hour before judging," Mrs. Peterson pressed. "The church kitchen is available." Thomas, appearing at her side with cups of hot cider, settled the matter. "You should enter, Martha. Your pies would put these to shame." The confidence in his voice decided her. "Very well. If you'll watch the children." "We'll manage," Thomas assured her. In the church kitchen, Martha worked quickly, using skills passed down from her mother. Her pie, apple with a touch of maple and a perfectly flaky crust, was cooling just as the judging began. To her astonishment, the blue ribbon was placed beside her entry after just a brief deliberation. Best balance of sweetness and spice. The judge, Reverend Simmons, declared, "A perfect example of home baking at its finest." Martha accepted the ribbon with flushed cheeks, aware of the murmurs of approval from the crowd, and of Thomas standing at the back, a rare smile softening his features. The day continued pleasantly. Thomas bought candy for the children, applauded local musicians, and even bid on a quilt at the charity auction. His unexpected sociability drew curious looks, but his dignified manner discouraged open gossip. It was near dusk, as lanterns were being lit for the evening dance, when Henry Crawford arrived with several of his ranch hands. He spotted Thomas and Martha sitting together on a bench, watching the children attempt to catch snowflakes on their tongues. "Well, well," Crawford said loudly enough to draw attention. "The recluse and his housekeeper have joined civilization." Thomas rose slowly. "Crawford, such a touching domestic scene," Crawford continued, his voice carrying to nearby festival goers. "Almost like a real family, though I wonder what Mrs. Blackwood would think of her replacement." A hush fell over the onlookers. Martha saw Thomas's hands clench into fists. "That's enough, Crawford," came an unexpected voice. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly milliner, stepped forward. "Elizabeth Blackwood was my dear friend, and she would be pleased to see Thomas finding happiness again." "Indeed," Reverend Simmons added, joining them. "The good book tells us there is a season for all things, a time to mourn, and a time to find comfort." Crawford's smirk faltered as others nodded in agreement. "Furthermore," Mrs. Abernathy continued, "Mrs. Hayes has proven herself a woman of character and skill." She held up Martha's prize ribbon. "Elizabeth would have approved of her apple pie if nothing else." A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Martha felt Thomas relax beside her. "Your concern for propriety is noted, Mr. Crawford," Reverend Simmons said pointedly, "though it might be better directed toward the conditions at your own ranch. I understand your workers' children lack proper winter clothing." Crawford flushed angrily. "Mind your own affairs, Reverend. The welfare of all children in my parish is my affair," the minister replied calmly. Outmaneuvered, Crawford retreated, but not before casting a venomous glance at Thomas and Martha. "This isn't over, Blackwood." As the crowd dispersed, Thomas turned to Martha. "Perhaps we should leave." "No," she said firmly. "We won't be driven away. The children are enjoying themselves." Indeed, the children had noticed nothing of the confrontation, entranced by the fiddlers tuning their instruments for the evening dance. "One more hour," Thomas conceded. "Then home." Martha's heart caught at his use of the word home, as if it truly belonged to all of them. On the wagon ride back to the farm, Emma fell asleep in Thomas's lap, her small hand clutching his coat button. When they arrived, he carried her inside, gently placing her on her bed and removing her shoes before Martha could take over. "You were magnificent today," he told Martha as they descended the stairs. "Everyone could see it, even with Crawford's unpleasantness? Especially then." Thomas hesitated, then reached for her hand. "Martha, Whatever he meant to say remained unspoken as James called from upstairs, needing help with his bootlaces. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them. A possibility too fragile yet to name, but too precious to ignore. 3 days after the festival, a rider approached the farm, his horse's hooves breaking through the crusty snow. Martha spotted him from the kitchen window, a thin man in a dark coat, a leather satchel strapped to his saddle. "Thomas," she called. "Someone's coming." Thomas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He squinted at the approaching figure, his expression darkening as recognition dawned. "Take the children upstairs," he said, his voice unnaturally flat. "What is it?" Martha asked, alarmed by his tone. "Leland Price, bank representative from Helena." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Martha could see the lie in his eyes. "I'll put on coffee," she said instead of arguing. The visitor dismounted stiffly, brushing snow from his coat. "Mr. Blackwood," he said with formal courtesy. "Pleasant to see you again, though I wish under better circumstances." Thomas nodded curtly. "Mr. Price, come inside." Martha had coffee waiting in the kitchen, the good cups set out on the table. She'd sent the children to play in the upstairs bedrooms, warning them to stay quiet. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Mr. Price inquired, removing his gloves. "Mrs. Hayes," Martha corrected. "I keep house for Mr. Blackwood." "Ah." The banker accepted a cup of coffee. "Perhaps we should speak privately, Mr. Blackwood." "Mrs. Hayes is aware of my affairs," Thomas said, though this wasn't strictly true. "Whatever you have to say can be said in front of her." Price opened his satchel and withdrew an official-looking document. "As you wish. I've come regarding the matter of your outstanding loan. The bank has been exceedingly patient, but after 3 missed payments—" "I explained my situation after the drought," Thomas interrupted. "Harvest was poor. Asked for an extension." "Yes, and you were granted one. But that was months ago." Price unfolded the paper. "I'm afraid I must deliver this notice of foreclosure proceedings." Martha gasped softly. Thomas's face remained impassive, though a muscle jumped in his jaw. "How much?" he asked. Price named a sum that made Martha's heart sink. It was more money than she'd seen in years. "You have 30 days to settle the debt in full," Price continued. "Otherwise, the property will be auctioned to satisfy the loan." 30 days, Thomas repeated. "Middle of winter. The bank regrets the timing, Price said without real regret in his voice. But business is business. After the banker departed, Thomas stood at the window, watching until the rider disappeared down the snow-covered lane. His shoulders were rigid with tension. "Why didn't you tell me?" Martha asked quietly. Thomas didn't turn. "Not your burden to bear, but the farm, your home, has been slipping away since Elizabeth got sick," he finished for her. "Medical bills, then the drought. Been selling off livestock, equipment, anything of value to keep up with payments." Martha thought of the half-empty barn, the sparse furnishings, the single cow. Signs she'd noticed but misinterpreted as bachelor simplicity rather than financial desperation. "There must be something we can do," she said. Thomas finally faced her. "Nothing to be done. Can't conjure money from air. But there must be options. A loan from someone else? Selling part of the land." Crawford's offered to buy. Several times. Thomas's expression hardened. "Always below fair value. Knowing I'd eventually have no choice." Martha understood suddenly. "That's why he was so unpleasant at the festival. He wants your land. Has for years. His property borders mine to the south. Wants to expand his ranch. And now he thinks he'll get it at auction for a fraction of its worth," Martha concluded. Thomas nodded grimly. "Likely already has an arrangement with the bank." Martha's mind raced. What about selling timber from the North Woods? Or, tried everything? Thomas cut her off. Too little, too late. He looked around the kitchen. At the stove where Martha baked bread each morning, the table where they'd shared meals, the window where Emma liked to watch birds at the feeder Thomas had built. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Should have told you before you settled in. Given you time to make other arrangements." "Don't talk like that," Martha said firmly. "We're not going anywhere. Not yet." Thomas shook his head. "You don't understand. When the farm goes, I have nothing. No home to offer you and the children. No position to—" He stopped abruptly. "To what?" Martha prompted softly. Thomas turned away. "Doesn't matter now." That night, after the children were asleep, Martha found Thomas in the barn, methodically cleaning harnesses by lantern light. "You should rest," she said, wrapping her shawl tighter against the cold. "Can't sleep," he replied without looking up. "Too much thinking to do." Martha sat beside him on a hay bale. "Tell me about the debt." "All of it." Thomas's hands stilled. For a long moment she thought he would refuse. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. Elizabeth's illness had begun 5 years ago. A persistent cough that worsened over months. They traveled to doctors in Helena, Butte, even as far as Denver, seeking treatments. Each specialist offered hope at ever-increasing costs. Thomas had sold off cattle, then equipment, then parcels of land, anything to buy more time with his wife. "She knew toward the end," he said, his voice barely audible. "Made me promise not to lose everything trying to save her. But I couldn't stop trying. After her death, the farm floundered. Thomas, lost in grief, neglected crops and livestock. The drought that followed destroyed what little remained of their livelihood. I've failed her," he finished simply. "Failed the land her grandfather homesteaded." Martha laid her hand over his, stilling his restless fingers. "You haven't failed anyone, Thomas. You fought for your wife, for your home. That's not failure, it's love." Thomas looked down at their joined hands. "What will you do when the farm is gone?" The question held layers of meaning Martha wasn't ready to explore. "We'll think of something," she said instead. "Together." But as she walked back to the house under the cold winter stars, Martha felt fear tightening around her heart. They had found sanctuary here, her children thriving, herself beginning to hope again. The thought of starting over, of seeing Thomas broken by the loss of his heritage, was more painful than she could admit. In her room, Martha opened the small wooden box containing her few valuables. Her mother's locket, Michael's watch fob, her own wedding ring on its string. Meager treasures worth little in monetary terms. But perhaps, she thought with sudden determination, there were other resources she hadn't considered. Tomorrow she would ride to town. Alone. Martha waited until Thomas left to repair a distant fence line before implementing her plan. She told the children she needed to visit the general store for supplies, instructing Sarah to watch her siblings until she returned. "What if Thomas comes back before you?" Sarah asked, always perceptive. "Tell him I've gone to town," Martha replied, fastening her cloak. "I won't be long." As she rode toward Pinewood on Thomas's old mare, Martha touched the small locket hanging beneath her dress. Her mother's, the only thing of value she hadn't sold during Michael's illness. It wouldn't fetch much, but perhaps enough to buy time to find a solution. The town was quiet on this ordinary Tuesday, no hint of the festival's recent gaiety. Martha tied the horse outside Peterson's store but walked past it to the imposing white building at the end of the street. A brass plaque beside the door read, "Crawford Enterprises." Inside, a clerk looked up with barely concealed disdain. "May I help you?" "I'd like to see Mr. Crawford," Martha said, keeping her voice steady. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but he'll want to speak with me." Martha removed her gloves. "Tell him Mrs. Hayes from the Blackwood farm is here." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, but he disappeared through a door, returning moments later. "Mr. Crawford will see you now." Henry Crawford's office suited the man, ostentatious, designed to intimidate. He rose as Martha entered, gesturing to a leather chair across from his massive desk. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "What a pleasant surprise." Martha remained standing. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment, Mr. Crawford. I'm always available to the people from our community." He studied her with undisguised interest. "What brings you to my office? Has life at Blackwood's farm become intolerable?" "On the contrary," Martha replied evenly. "I've come about the foreclosure notice." Crawford's smile faltered momentarily. "Banking matters are confidential, Mrs. Hayes. Yet you seem well informed about Thomas's situation." "Small town," Crawford shrugged, seating himself. "News travels." "Indeed." Martha finally sat, arranging her skirts with deliberate calm. "I understand you've made offers to purchase the farm previously. Business opportunities arise. I'd be remiss not to pursue them." Crawford leaned forward. "Has Blackwood sent you to negotiate on his behalf?" "No," Martha admitted. "He doesn't know I'm here." Interest sharpened Crawford's gaze. "Intriguing. Please continue." Martha took a deep breath. "I've come to ask what it would take for you to help Thomas keep his farm." Crawford laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Why would I do that when I can acquire the property at auction for a fraction of its value?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Martha said, though she'd expected this response. "Mrs. Hayes," Crawford said condescendingly, "business isn't about right things, it's about profitable things." Martha reached for her mother's locket, fingers trembling slightly as she unfastened it. "I have this. It's valuable gold with a pearl inset." Crawford barely glanced at it. "A trinket worth perhaps $20. Blackwood's debt exceeds $2,000. The sum staggered Martha. She'd known it was substantial but hadn't realized the magnitude. "However," Crawford continued, his tone shifting, "there are other arrangements we might consider." "What sort of arrangements?" Martha asked warily. Crawford stood, circling his desk to lean against it, uncomfortably close to her chair. "I'm in need of a housekeeper. My current one is inadequate. The position includes private quarters, good wages, and certain additional considerations for a woman of your qualities." Martha felt a chill despite the well-heated office. "And Thomas's farm?" "I could be persuaded to extend a personal loan to Blackwood. Enough to satisfy the bank." Crawford smiled thinly. Strictly business, of course. Of course, Martha echoed, understanding perfectly his unstated expectations. And my children? The girls could train as house servants. The boy? Crawford waved dismissively. Perhaps stable work when he's older. Martha stood abruptly. Thank you for your time, Mr. Crawford. I'll have to decline. Crawford's smile vanished. Don't be hasty, Mrs. Hayes. Your options are limited. When Blackwood loses his farm, where will you go? Back to that miserable cabin? The streets. We'll manage, Martha said, moving toward the door. Wait. Crawford's voice hardened. There's something you should know before you leave. Martha paused, her hand on the doorknob. The foreclosure is no accident, Crawford said, satisfaction evident in his tone. I purchased Blackwood's loan from the Helena Bank 2 months ago. The timing, the terms, all my doing. Martha turned slowly. You engineered this? Deliberately forced him into default. Crawford shrugged. Business strategy. I want that land, Mrs. Hayes. It completes my northern holdings and controls water access to the entire valley. You're destroying a man's life for water rights? For progress. For the future of this county. Crawford straightened. Blackwood is the past. A relic clinging to outdated ways. Men like me are the future. Martha studied him with new clarity. Does the bank representative know you own the loan? Price? He works for me now. Crawford smiled coldly. As I said, I control the situation completely. Not completely, Martha countered. Thomas could find another lender. Crawford laughed. Who? I own the only bank within 100 miles. No one would extend credit against property already in foreclosure. He stepped closer. My offer stands. Consider it carefully. For your children's sake. Martha lifted her chin. My children are precisely why I must refuse, Mr. Crawford. I wouldn't have them learn values from a man like you. Anger flashed in Crawford's eyes. You'll regret this decision, Mrs. Hayes. When you're homeless again, remember who offered you shelter. Good day, Mr. Crawford, Martha said, her voice steadier than her nerves as she left the office. Outside, the winter air cleared her thoughts. Crawford's scheme was worse than she'd imagined. Not opportunism but calculated destruction. And she'd nearly walked into his trap, offering herself as payment for Thomas's salvation. As she untied the mare, Martha noticed Sheriff Wilson watching her from across the street. He tipped his hat but made no move to approach. Had he seen her enter Crawford's office? What would he think of her mission? More importantly, what would Thomas think when he learned where she'd been today? Martha rode home slowly, the weight of her failure heavy on her shoulders. The locket seemed to burn against her skin, a useless token against the forces aligned against them. What had she been thinking, believing she could save a farm with a piece of jewelry and determination? Yet Crawford's revelations had given her valuable information. Thomas needed to know he was fighting not just financial difficulties but deliberate sabotage. As the farm came into view, Martha saw Thomas's figure by the barn, returned earlier than expected. He was watching for her, his stance rigid with concern, or was it anger? She straightened her back and urged the mare forward. There would be difficult explanations ahead, but truth was their only weapon now. Thomas was waiting by the barn when Martha dismounted, his expression a storm of emotions she couldn't fully decipher. Sarah said you went to town, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Alone. Martha handed him the mare's reins. Yes, to see Crawford. Not a question. Martha's eyes widened. How did you? Sheriff Wilson rode out. Thought I should know my housekeeper. Was having private meetings with Henry Crawford. Thomas's jaw tightened. Want to tell me why? Martha straightened her shoulders. I went to ask for his help with the loan. His help? Thomas repeated incredulously. The man's been trying to take my land for years. I know that now, Martha said. But I had to try something. I couldn't just stand by and watch you lose everything. Thomas turned away, leading the mare into the barn. Martha followed, unwilling to let the conversation end. He told me he purchased your loan from the Helena Bank, she continued. He's deliberately forcing the foreclosure to get your land cheaply. Thomas paused in removing the mare's saddle. He told you this? He was quite proud of his business strategy, Martha said bitterly. He wants your water rights for his cattle operation. Thomas hung the saddle on its rack with deliberate care. And what did he want from you in return for his help? Martha hesitated. He offered me a position as his housekeeper. His housekeeper, Thomas repeated flatly. And you believed that's all he wanted? Of course not, Martha replied sharply. I'm not naive, Thomas. I refused him immediately. The tension in Thomas's shoulders eased slightly. Good. But we still need a solution, Martha pressed. There must be something we've overlooked. Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I've been over it 100 times. Can't get a new loan. Can't sell enough timber or livestock to cover the debt. Can't. What about mineral rights? Martha interrupted. Your grandfather homesteaded this land during the first mining boom, didn't he? Thomas stared at her. How did you know that? You mentioned it during the blizzard. Said he came west looking for silver but settled for farming instead. That's right, Thomas nodded slowly. Found enough color in the creek to stake a claim, but the vein played out quickly. Turned to farming after that. But he would have registered mineral rights when he filed his claim, Martha reasoned. Those rights should still belong to the property. Thomas's expression shifted from skepticism to consideration. Even if they do, the silver's gone. Been picked clean by 65. Maybe the silver, Martha agreed. But what about other minerals? Coal? Perhaps, or copper? Don't know much about mining, Thomas admitted. Michael was the miner in your family. Yes, and he always said the first prospectors only took what was easy to find. Sometimes the real wealth lay deeper. Martha's mind raced with possibilities. Do you have the original deed? The claim paperwork? Thomas hesitated, then nodded. In my grandfather's trunk. Haven't looked at those papers in years. They moved to the house with new purpose. In the attic, Thomas pulled out a weathered leather trunk covered in dust. Inside, beneath old clothing and personal effects, lay a metal box containing yellow documents. Here, Thomas said, carefully unfolding a large parchment. Original land grant and mineral claim, signed by the territorial governor in 1852. Martha leaned close, their shoulders touching as they examined the document. The formal language was difficult to decipher, but certain phrases stood out clearly. Look, she pointed. It specifically grants all mineral rights in perpetuity to claimant and heirs. Thomas nodded. But like I said, the silver played out generations ago. What about this? Martha indicated a survey map attached to the deed. These markings in the northern section, what are they? Thomas squinted at the faded ink. Not sure. Grandfather mentioned coal deposits once, but said they were too difficult to access with the technology of his day. Coal, Martha repeated thoughtfully. The railroad's always looking for new coal sources. The Helena line expanded last year. They're closer to your property now than when your grandfather made his assessment. Thomas looked at her with growing interest. You think we could sell the mineral rights? Just the rights, not the land. It's worth investigating, Martha said. The mining company might pay well for guaranteed access to coal deposits, especially with the railroad so close. For the first time since the foreclosure notice arrived, a spark of hope appeared in Thomas's eyes. We'd need to find someone who knows about these things. A mining engineer, maybe. The county seat would have records of active mining companies, Martha suggested. We could make inquiries. Thomas carefully refolded the documents. It's a slim chance, But it is a chance, Martha insisted. Better than surrendering to Crawford. Thomas studied her face, his expression softening. Why are you doing this, Martha? Fighting so hard for a farm that isn't yours? The question caught her off guard. Why indeed was she so invested in saving Thomas's heritage? The practical answer that she and her children needed a home seemed inadequate against the depth of her concern. Because it matters to you, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. And you matter to me. The admission hung between them, more revealing than she'd intended. Thomas reached out slowly, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on the deed. I thought you'd be gone by spring, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Back when we made our arrangement. Thought it was just until the weather broke. I thought so too, Martha admitted. But now? Thomas prompted when she didn't continue. Martha met his gaze directly. Now I can't. Imagine being anywhere else. The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Thomas's fingers tightened around hers. A sudden crash from downstairs broke the spell, followed by Emma's wail and James's immediate, "It wasn't me." Martha smiled ruefully. "I should go see what they've destroyed." Thomas nodded, but didn't release her hand immediately. "We'll go to the county seat tomorrow," he said. "Look into these mineral rights together." Together, Martha agreed, the word carrying more promise than either of them could openly acknowledge. As she descended the attic stairs, Martha felt lighter than she had in days. They had a plan, tenuous perhaps, but a fighting chance. And more importantly, they had finally spoken aloud the changing nature of their relationship. Whatever came next, they would face it as a united front. The county seat of Helena was a 3-hour journey by wagon, requiring an early start. Thomas and Martha left the children with Mrs. Abernathy, who had offered her assistance after the festival, declaring that any household that can produce such a fine apple pie deserves neighborly support. "They'll be fine," Martha reassured Thomas as he checked the wagon's wheels one last time. Mrs. Abernathy raised 6 children of her own. "It's not the children I'm worried about," Thomas replied. "It's what Crawford might do if he learns we're pursuing this." The journey passed in companionable conversation. Martha shared stories of her childhood on her father's farm, and Thomas pointed out landmarks along the route, including the distant peaks where his grandfather had first prospected for silver. "Never much cared for cities," Thomas admitted as Helena's buildings came into view. "Too many people, too much noise." "Michael loved them," Martha said. "The excitement, the opportunities. That's why we kept moving from camp to camp. He was always chasing the next big strike." "And you?" Thomas asked. "What did you want?" Martha considered this. "Stability, I suppose. A place where the children could put down roots." She smiled faintly. "Ironic that I found it by stealing a cow." Thomas's laugh surprised them both. A deep, genuine sound that Martha realized she'd rarely heard. "Life takes unexpected turns," he agreed. At the county records office, they pored over maps and mining claims, confirming that Thomas's mineral rights remained intact and uncontested. The clerk, impressed by the age and completeness of Thomas's documentation, directed them to the offices of Western Mining and Development. "They're buying up coal rights all through the territory," he explained. "With the railroad expansion, fuel demand is high." The Western Mining office occupied the ground floor of a brick building near the train station. Inside, clerks in shirt sleeves bent over drafting tables, while well-dressed men conferred in glass-walled offices. "May I help you?" inquired a young man at the reception desk, eyeing their rural attire with barely concealed disdain. "We'd like to speak with someone about mineral rights," Thomas said, straightening to his full height. "Specifically, coal deposits." "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm afraid all our engineers are fully scheduled today. Perhaps you could return next week." Martha stepped forward. "We've traveled from Pinewood County with original mineral claims dating to the territorial period. The deposits intersect with the new railroad expansion. Her confident tone and specific details caught the attention of an older man emerging from a nearby office. Pinewood County, you say? He approached, adjusting his spectacles. Near the new Helena Southern Line? Yes, sir, Martha confirmed. The property borders Pine Creek for 2 miles. Interesting. He extended his hand. Edward Harrington, chief engineer. And you are? Thomas Blackwood. Thomas shook the offered hand. This is Mrs. Martha Hayes. Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly at their different surnames, but he made no comment. Come into my office. Let's see these claims of yours. Inside a well-appointed room lined with geological maps, Harrington examined Thomas's documents with professional interest. These are remarkably well preserved, he commented, and the survey work appears sound, despite its age. My grandfather was thorough, Thomas said with quiet pride. Harrington unrolled a large map across his desk. Show me exactly where your property lies. Thomas indicated the boundaries, while Martha pointed out the markings they'd found indicating possible coal deposits. Yes, Harrington nodded. This aligns with our own surveys. We've documented significant coal seams throughout that region. He studied them thoughtfully. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Blackwood? We're interested in selling the mineral rights, Thomas said. Not the land itself. I see. Harrington leaned back in his chair. And why would a landowner of your standing suddenly take interest in mineral rights that have been dormant for generations? Martha tensed at the implicit question about their finances, but Thomas answered calmly. Times change. What wasn't economically viable for my grandfather might be valuable now, with the railroad so close. Indeed, Harrington nodded. Well, I can certainly say Western Mining would be interested in acquiring those rights. We'd need to conduct our own survey to confirm the extent and quality of the deposits, but based on our existing data of the region, I believe we could make a fair offer. Hope flickered in Martha's chest. How soon could such a survey be completed? Ordinarily, we'd schedule it within the month. Harrington consulted a calendar. However, given the winter conditions, we're facing some time constraints, Thomas said carefully. A more immediate assessment would be appreciated. Something in his tone made Harrington look up sharply. Financial pressures, Mr. Blackwood? Thomas hesitated, and Martha feared he might withdraw rather than admit their desperate circumstances. To her surprise, he nodded. The farm is under threat of foreclosure. We have less than a month to resolve the situation. Harrington's expression shifted to one of calculation. I see. That does change matters. He made a note on his pad. Who holds your note, if I may ask? Crawford Enterprises, Martha answered. Henry Crawford purchased it from the Helena Bank. Recognition flashed in Harrington's eyes. Crawford. Yes, we've had dealings with him. He's been quite aggressive in acquiring water rights throughout the region. He wants our land for the creek access, Thomas explained. Controls water for the entire Eastern Valley if he gets it. Harrington tapped his pen thoughtfully. Water and coal, valuable combination. He stood abruptly. Wait here. Left alone, Martha and Thomas exchanged hopeful glances. He seems interested, she whispered. Interested, yes, but will it be enough? And, in time, Thomas's fingers drummed nervously on the armrest. Harrington returned with another man, older, expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of authority. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Hayes, this is Augustus Wilson, company president. Wilson shook their hands firmly. Harrington has explained your situation. Unfortunate timing, but potentially advantageous for all parties. Sir, Thomas questioned. We've had our eye on that region for some time, Wilson explained. Crawford has been obstructive to our expansion plans. This could be an opportunity to establish a foothold in the area. Martha's heart raced. Then you're interested in purchasing the mineral rights? Potentially. Wilson nodded to Harrington, who spread out a fresh map. Show us again exactly where these coal seams are located. As Thomas leaned forward to indicate the markings, the office door opened without warning. Henry Crawford strode in, removing his hat with practiced elegance. Wilson, Harrington, he greeted the mining executives. I was informed you were meeting with some of my neighbors. Martha froze, her eyes meeting Thomas's in alarm. How had Crawford discovered their presence so quickly? Wilson's expression remained neutral. Mr. Crawford, this is unexpected. Crawford smiled thinly. I happened to be conducting business nearby when I saw Mr. Blackwood's wagon. Thought I should join the conversation, given my interest in the property in question. Your interest? Wilson inquired politely. Indeed. Crawford turned to Thomas, his smile never reaching his eyes. Did you forget to mention that your farm will be mine within the month? Any negotiations regarding its mineral rights would be premature at best, misleading at worst. An uncomfortable silence filled the office as Crawford's words hung in the air. Thomas stood slowly, his face hardening into the expression Martha had first seen when he tracked her to the cabin. The farm isn't yours yet, Crawford, he said quietly. And it won't be if we have anything to say about it. Crawford smiled condescendingly. Admirable spirit, Blackwood, but mathematics doesn't lie. You're $2,000 short with 26 days remaining. These gentlemen deserve to know they're wasting their time. Augustus Wilson studied both men with shrewd eyes. Perhaps we should clarify the situation. Mr. Blackwood, you own the property and all current mineral rights. Correct. Yes, Thomas confirmed. Has been in my family for 3 generations. And Mr. Crawford, you hold the loan against the property, currently in foreclosure? Crawford nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Precisely. The auction is already scheduled. Wilson exchanged glances with Harrington. Interesting. Very interesting. He turned to Thomas. Would you gentlemen excuse us for a moment? I'd like a private word with my chief engineer. When the executives stepped out, Crawford moved closer to Thomas and Martha. Pathetic attempt, he said softly. Did you really think you could circumvent me so easily? How did you know we were here? Martha demanded. Small towns, loose lips. Crawford shrugged. The milliner's grandson works for the stage office. Mentioned you'd left your children in her care for a trip to Helena. It wasn't difficult to guess your purpose. Thomas's jaw tightened. You had us followed. Let's call it protecting my investment. Crawford adjusted his expensive cufflinks. I've worked too long to secure that water access to let it slip away now. It's not yours yet, Martha repeated Thomas's words. Crawford's gaze shifted to her, cold and calculating. Still playing the loyal companion, Mrs. Hayes? I wonder if Blackwood knows what you were willing to offer me to save his precious farm. Thomas stiffened. Martha laid a restraining hand on his arm. I offered nothing but a locket, she said clearly, which you dismissed as worthless. Any other implications were entirely of your own invention. Before Crawford could respond, Wilson and Harrington returned, accompanied by a clerk carrying documents. Gentlemen, Mrs. Hayes, Wilson began, we've reached a decision. Western Mining is prepared to make an immediate offer for the mineral rights to the Blackwood property. Hope flared in Martha's chest, quickly tempered by Crawford's smug smile. As I've explained, Crawford interjected smoothly, any such transaction would be premature. Not at all, Wilson countered. Mr. Blackwood retains full legal ownership until foreclosure is complete. His right to sell the mineral rights, separate from the land itself, remains intact. Crawford's smile faltered. The debt encumbers all aspects of the property. Actually, no, Harrington said, producing a legal text. Montana territorial law specifically distinguishes surface rights from mineral rights in foreclosure proceedings. The 1873 statute is quite clear on this point. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Crawford's face. Even so, why would you gamble on rights you might acquire more cleanly after foreclosure? Because we need those rights now, not in a month or two after legal battles, Wilson replied candidly. The railroad spur is being laid as we speak. Delays cost money, Mr. Crawford, as a businessman like yourself surely understands. He turned to Thomas. We're prepared to offer $1,500 for exclusive mineral rights to the coal deposits on your property, with a 10% royalty on all extracted resources. Martha caught her breath. $1,500 wouldn't cover the entire debt, but it would be enough to negotiate with the bank for an extension, perhaps even refinance at better terms. Crawford must have reached the same conclusion. I'll match that offer, he said quickly. $1,500 for the entire property, no foreclosure. That's less than half its value, Thomas objected. But more than you'll see at auction, Crawford countered. Cash in hand today. Wilson raised an eyebrow. We're prepared to draw up papers immediately and issue payment before close of business. Crawford's face darkened. This is absurd. The mineral rights are worthless without access to the property. Not at all, Harrington interjected. The statute grants reasonable access rights to the mineral owner. Another provision you might want to familiarize yourself with. Martha watched the calculations running behind Crawford's eyes. If Thomas sold the mineral rights and used the money to prevent foreclosure, Crawford would lose both the water access he coveted and the coal deposits he hadn't known existed. I have an established relationship with the bank, Crawford said, changing tactics. They won't accept partial payment on the loan. Perhaps they would reconsider, came a new voice from the doorway. If presented with evidence of improper collusion. Sheriff Wilson stood there, hat in hand, with a distinguished gentleman in a majestic authority. The lead steers, confronted with her impressive horns and unwavering stance, veered away at the last moment. Those behind followed, the stampede's direction effectively turned by a single animal's courage. With watches over the valley and the drovers working in coordination, the runaway cattle were gradually brought under control, then guided back to the main herd. Not a single animal was lost to the panic, an outcome McCready later declared nothing short of miraculous. That evening, as the drive camped for the night under clearing skies, the trail boss approached Standing Cloud with something clutched in his weathered hand. Been driving cattle for 30 years, McCready said without preamble. Never seen anything like what your longhorn did today. He opened his palm to reveal a tarnished badge. This was my father's. He was trail boss on the first drives up from Texas after the war. Reckon he'd want someone with your kind of cattle sense to have it. A year passed since the day Standing Cloud had stood at the corral of Whiskey Creek Ranch, watching men back away in fear from the demon cow they believed could not be tamed. The seasons had completed their cycle, summer to fall, winter to spring, and back to summer again. With each turning month, Standing Cloud's place in the community of Bitter Springs had grown more secure, his wisdom more widely sought, his presence more valued. His modest homestead had transformed as well. The single cabin had been expanded to accommodate his sister's family, who had decided to make their home with him permanently. A proper barn now stood where once there had been only a rough shelter. Fields that had lain fallow now produced corn, beans, and squash in the traditional companion planting of his people. Most remarkably, Watches over the valley was no longer alone. She had been bred to a neighboring rancher's prize bull, resulting in a strong calf that showed the same intelligent eyes and steady temperament as his mother. Standing Cloud had named the calf first of new herd, honoring both his heritage and his hopes for the future. On the anniversary of the purchase, Standing Cloud rose before dawn and walked to the small rise where Watches over the valley often stood sentinel. The longhorn was already there, her massive silhouette outlined against the lightning eastern sky, her young calf grazing nearby. One cycle completed, Standing Cloud said in Apache as he reached her side. You have traveled far from who you were to who you were meant to be. The longhorn lowered her great head in what had become a gesture of acknowledgement between them. Over the months, their communication had deepened beyond what Standing Cloud would have thought possible, evolving into a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. Later that morning, as Standing Cloud worked on constructing a new gate for the expanded corral, he noticed a dust cloud approaching from the direction of town. Watches over the valley noticed it too, moving to her customary observation point but showing no signs of alarm. She had learned to differentiate between friendly visitors and potential threats long before Standing Cloud could make out their identity. The approaching riders resolved into a small procession, Sheriff Mills at the lead, followed by Reverend Masterson, Mayor Hollister, and several other prominent citizens of Bitter Springs. Behind them came a wagon driven by Eli Thompson, laden with what appeared to be building materials. "Hope we're not interrupting," the sheriff called as they approached. "Brought some folks who wanted to mark the occasion." Standing Cloud set aside his tools and moved to greet the visitors, watches over the valley following at an unhurried pace. Her presence no longer caused alarm among the townspeople. In fact, several of the riders nodded in greeting to her specifically. "1 year today since you bought this magnificent animal," Mayor Hollister announced, dismounting with some effort. The town council thought it fitting to acknowledge how much has changed since then. From the wagon, Thompson and several others unloaded lumber, posts, and hardware, materials for a new entrance gate to Standing Cloud's property. Unlike the utilitarian structures common to ranch entrances in the territory, this gate featured decorative elements and careful craftsmanship. "Designed it myself," Thompson explained proudly. "Notice there's no lock or latch on the outside, just like you've been teaching us about trust being more effective than constraint." As the men set to work installing the new gate, Reverend Masterson approached Standing Cloud. "Your story, yours and hers, has spread beyond Bitter Springs," he said, nodding toward watches over the valley. "Travelers passing through ask about the Indian who tamed the demon cow. I always correct them." "What do you tell them?" Standing Cloud asked. "That you didn't tame her at all. You simply showed her who she truly was beneath the fear and pain." The gate installation had drawn a small crowd of additional visitors, including families from neighboring homesteads who had come to mark the occasion. Children played near watches over the valley, no longer seeing the fearsome beast of local legend, but instead the gentle guardian who had protected their community through flood and fire. Among the last to arrive was a lone rider whose approach caused a subtle shift in the gathering's mood. Jeremiah Harrison had rarely been seen in Bitter Springs since the failure of Whiskey Creek Ranch had forced him to sell his remaining land and take work as a hired hand on a distant property. He dismounted stiffly, his once proud bearing diminished by the past year's hardships. Standing Cloud watched his approach without comment, aware of the man's fall from prominence but offering neither judgment nor satisfaction at the reversal of fortune. "Heard about the anniversary gathering," Harrison said, his voice roughened by drink and regret. "Thought I should see for myself." His gaze moved to watches over the valley, who regarded him with calm recognition rather than the fear or aggression that had characterized their previous relationship. The transformation in the animal seemed to affect Harrison deeply. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands as he searched for words. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About her. About you. About a lot of things." Standing Cloud acknowledged the difficult admission with a nod. "The past is behind us. Like this gate." He gestured to the nearly completed entrance to his property. "We choose what we allow to enter our lives going forward." As the sun reached its zenith, the gathered community shared a meal together on Standing Cloud's land. Apache and settler, rancher and townsperson, former adversaries now breaking bread as neighbors. Watches over the valley moved among them with serene confidence, occasionally allowing the children to